It is good to see everybody here this morning. It's a holiday weekend, which means obviously there are a lot of people traveling. We've got a lot of our members that are gone away and are traveling, visiting family, or just spending time together. But the flip side is we're fortunate to have a lot of visitors come our way this weekend too. And so we're especially grateful for your presence. You might be wondering what the polar bears on the wall might be. No, we're not praying for winter yet. Some of you, no, I'm not talking weather. I've given up on that. These are the remnants of our vacation Bible school that just concluded last week. We had 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and it was a great week. We had what I thought was a great turnout, good participation from the community along with members of our own congregation. And I just want to extend my thank you to everybody that put in just a lot of hard work. There were a lot of people that contributed to the success. A lot of people that worked behind the scenes, and it wouldn't have been what it was without you. So thank you for your participation in that. So if you've been with us the last few weeks, we've been talking about words that are affiliated with the church, we might say. So we talked about God's plan for leadership in the church by looking at the words elders and the words deacons. And then last week, we actually talked about the word church itself. And we talked about how the church is a body of believers, how God can take a group of individuals and bring them together collectively to form this body of people that are meant to carry out the work of the church. And you think about those words, and they're positive and encouraging words, and they build this beautiful picture of the church. But when we think about the word church, we also need to be honest enough to recognize that for some people that word doesn't carry a positive connotation. There are people that have been hurt and disappointed by the church. And as a result, they've just withdrawn themselves and they really don't associate or participate in the concept of quote-unquote church anymore. There are others that might feel like the church teaches something, but then doesn't live it out through the example in their lives. And so they label the church hypocrites and distance themselves as far away as they can. But there's actually another group of people as well that struggle with the idea of church. And believe it or not, they show up every week. They're here as a part of our midst. And yet, when it's over and they walk out their door and they get in their car, they think to themselves, is this it? Is this really all there is to church? They leave feeling alone, even though they sit in a building with 150 or even 5,000 people in some cases. They leave feeling like there's no real connection, that nobody really knows them. Maybe even feeling like, if I never come back, nobody will even notice or care. I want you to think with me for a moment. If you could go back in time to Scriptures and maybe think about a moment in time when the church was as close to perfect as it possibly could be. Because you see, there's this dilemma that exists. The church, in its concept and designed by God, is perfect in every way possible. But the carrying out of that design or concept is imperfect because it's left to be carried out by imperfect people like me and you. You know, I'm sure there are a handful of examples in Scripture, maybe of church in what might be as close to its perfect context as possible. But this morning, I invite you to open your Bibles with me to Acts chapter 2. Because for me, when I think about a time, when I read about the church, even in a brief glimpse, and think about this is as close to perfect as God could want, I can't help but think about Acts chapter 2. And we're going to talk in a little bit of detail here in a moment about some of the circumstances that lead up to the events and everything that happens in Acts chapter 2. But by way of introduction, the church has just been established, if you will, for lack of a better term. And it's in what we would call its infancy stages. I mean, it truly is the breath of a new beginning. Thousands of souls, about 3,000, verse 41 would say, have responded to a sermon that Peter would preach and have been joined together with Christ through baptism. And I want you to notice what we read in verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. You see, there's a group of people that are united together in certain things. And this verse talks about things that we're going to label spiritual things. Things that kind of align to a spiritual concept. And in the midst of these things that are talked about, there's a word that I want us to focus together on this morning. And the word is fellowship. It's a powerful word. It's a word we actually use maybe somewhat frequently. And a lot of times we use it in connection with a potluck, right? It has food, and food is certainly a part of fellowship. And a potluck is a form of fellowship. But it's so much more than that. You see, the word in its simplest form really just means sharing. It means sharing, though, in a very deep and profound way. And I want us to think about this concept of fellowship this morning and how it relates to us as a church. I want us to see what we can learn about fellowship from just a few verses here in Acts chapter 2, and then maybe challenge ourselves to think about how can we grow in this important area of our spiritual lives to create relationships that are meaningful and profound so that nobody leaves this building thinking, I don't matter. Let's consider some things together. The first thing we're going to notice as we study is that fellowship involved a sharing of their possessions. Let's read together. Verse 42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. So let's just stop there and let's think about this idea of sharing their possessions and how that played into the concept of fellowship. And maybe it seems a little strange to you and me to read these verses and think about, hey, these people were worshiping together and they were seeing all these incredible works that were being done, and then just all of a sudden it talks about they were selling their possessions and sharing together and meeting each other's needs. Why? Let's think a little bit about the background and everything that's going on here for just a moment. So what's happening here is a Jewish feast or festival known as Pentecost has been happening. And as a result, Pentecost required all male Jews to travel to Jerusalem for this particular feast. So you had Jews from all different areas scattered. Some had come from great distances. Some maybe were more local to Jerusalem. There would have been women there as well. And they were all gathered together in Jerusalem to celebrate this religious feast. This feast occurred some 50 days after the Passover. But you see, this wasn't a typical Pentecost. Something is happening at this particular Pentecost that's going to make it different. And it all started again some 50 days earlier as Jesus has been crucified, nailed to a cross. But as you and I know, He didn't stay there. He was resurrected, and for those 50 days, He presented Himself in His resurrected form to the apostles and hundreds of other disciples. And literally just days earlier, He has ascended back up into heaven. And He has left the apostles to carry out His mission on earth. And that mission begins in earnest here in Acts chapter 2, as Peter would preach what we often call the first sermon about the incredible good news of Jesus. And thousands of these Jews that had come to Jerusalem thinking this was going to be another Pentecost that they would participate in, find themselves experiencing something completely new and different. And see, as we've already mentioned, many of them had come from great distances and they had prepared to stay for a certain amount of time. But as they had experienced the message of Christ and the fact that He was a Messiah, there's a realization that occurs in their lives now. There's a lot they have to learn. everything they've known is about to change in incredibly drastic ways. They need to stay here in Jerusalem. They need the apostles' instruction and teaching. But even as important as that, they need the encouragement and the strength of each other, because they are the beginning of this incredible new community of God's people. And as a result of all these changes and everything that's happening, there were people that found themselves in a situation where their needs ran out, or the things they had prepared for ran out, and now they had needs they had not planned for. And what we read about here is not a situation where everybody just brought all they had together, put it in a pot, and then just redistributed it to everybody. We don't find an example here of a commandment that required them to do what they're doing. The apostles weren't requiring them to sell what they had and give it to other people. They willfully chose to give of what they had to help meet the needs of these new people that they had this incredible new relationship with. How does that happen? How do you develop that kind of attitude? Turn maybe just a page over in your Bibles to chapter 4. And I want you to read something with me there. Beginning in verse 32. Now the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. You see, there's an interesting phrase there that we read that helps give us some insight into how this attitude developed. Any of the things that belonged to him was his own. They didn't believe that. They didn't view their possessions as more important than the relationship that they experienced with this new group of people that were brought together through Christ. You know, it's hard for us, I think, sometimes to truly appreciate how incredible this concept of the Messiah was to the Jews that were gathered there. They had literally been waiting centuries for the Messiah. I would venture to say that there may not have been a day that went by in the lives of most Jews where this concept of Messiah wouldn't have been talked about in some way, shape, or form. And they came to the realization on this particular Pentecost that the very one they had been waiting for their whole lives, that they had crucified Him. They may not have been the ones that physically drove the spikes through His hands and His feet, but through their rejection of His proclamation that He was the Messiah, they in essence were guilty of that very thing. But yet they realized through the grace and mercy of God that there's an answer to the problem, that they can still enjoy the full expectations and benefits of the Messiah by being connected with His death, burial, and resurrection through baptism. And once they experienced that, nothing else mattered more than that. Nothing. Nothing they owned, not their possessions, not where they had to be, not their homes, wherever they might have been. Nothing was more important to them than being connected to Christ and to other people that were experiencing that. And so when they looked out at those that were experiencing that with them, and they saw people that needed food, and they saw brothers and sisters that needed clothing maybe, or needed a place to stay, needed a home away from home, they made sure that those needs were met. Because you see, fellowship was about them sharing in their possessions, because they didn't view it as mine. They viewed it as God's. And you're my brother. You're my sister, and I want to be connected to you. And if that requires me helping you in this way, then I'm going to do it. And so they shared together in this incredible way. But they also had fellowship by sharing in their presence. Let's keep reading. Verse 46 of Acts chapter 2. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. You see, we already read in verse 44 that all who believed were together and had all things in common. There's this togetherness that's happening. And again, I want you to think about a change in perspective that had to occur in their minds. Remember, these are Jews. They already share in this incredible, what we'll call national bond or heritage, just by being Jews. But you know, a lot's happened to them as a nation over the centuries. Over hundreds of years, through many times their own fault, by turning to idolatry, they've been dispersed out of their homeland, Jerusalem. And so there are some that live in Jerusalem, and there are others that have been scattered throughout all these different regions. And as a result, I can't help but picture what that scene was like in Jerusalem for this Pentecost, and really any Pentecost. Even though thousands of Jews came together and shared in this national and even religious bond, there's a strong probability that many of them had never even met each other before. And if they had, it would have been superficial or at a distance at best. But as we've already mentioned, they've experienced something profound that's fundamentally changed their lives. And we read they believed and had all things in common. And I can't help but ask, how? How could they have all things in common? I mean, there's a lot of things that would have been different about these people. They didn't all even speak the same dialect. There would have been variations of languages in which they spoke. We kind of read about that in Acts chapter 2, the beginning part. They come from different towns. They come from different family backgrounds. They come from different socioeconomic statuses. They have different trades. But yet now, all of a sudden, people that maybe have never met each other before and at best had a distant relationship, now they have all things in common. And again, the only thing this can be attributed to is through this unique relationship they now share through Jesus. And as a result of this unique relationship that somehow has the ability to conquer the differences that are in their lives, they want to share in each other's presence every day. When you look at verse 46, the emphasis on that verse is found in the phrase day by day or daily or every day. You see, the emphasis is on the fact that they came together every single day. And I think it's interesting where they went. It says they attended the temple together. More than likely, where they went was an area of the temple known as Solomon's Porch. It would have been on the eastern side of the temple. And it was a special place to the Jews because it was one of the last remnants of the original temple built by Solomon. And they would come together here daily. People would gather, and it was a place for intellectual discussion and learning. So you think about that and how they shared in their presence every day. They shared in this newfound excitement, this newfound joy of who Jesus was, but yet they needed to learn more and discuss the Messiah more and what it meant to be in this new community of people and how all of this might unfold in their lives and the changes that were occurring. Imagine trying to process all that. So they shared in their presence together on a daily basis. If you were with us last week, we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And the example there that Paul uses to illustrate the church as a body, and he uses the analogy of the human body to the church. And in verse 26, it talks about this incredible feature of being a part of the body. It says, if one suffers, we all suffer together. And if one is honored, we all rejoice together. You see, there's just something unique about our presence together. Sometimes our presence together involves mourning. It involves sorrow. It involves sharing in the burdens that we go through. And it involves us doing that together. And at times it involves, and let's hope maybe even the majority of the time, it involves rejoicing. And I think there was a lot of rejoicing going on here in Acts chapter 2, but the emphasis is on the idea of experiencing life together. And that happens through sharing our presence with each other. And that's exactly what's happening here in Acts chapter 2. But as we think about this concept of fellowship even a little bit more, we see that they also shared their plates together. We just read in verse 46 that they received their food with glad and generous hearts. You see, they didn't just share in their possessions and say, here's what you need, go on about your way. They didn't just come together every day and talk about this newfound excitement, this newfound way that God was working in their lives through the coming of the Messiah and what this new life meant. They spent time together every day around a table sharing food together. Not weekly, not monthly, but on a daily basis. They were eating meals together. I want you to think back with me to Jesus' ministry. You ever stop and think about how eating meals with people was such a foundational part of Jesus' ministry? More than likely, Jesus would have shared a meal with people at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. He would have probably shared a meal together with Mary and Martha as he came to their home. We know that he ate with Matthew. He ate with Simon the Pharisee. He shared a meal with Simon the leper. He ate with tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. That's just a handful of examples of people that Jesus sat down and shared a meal with. Why do you think that was such a vital part of Jesus' ministry? I think most of us have had the opportunity to sit down at a table and share a meal with somebody else. And if you've done that, you know that something just different happens when you sit down to share a meal, doesn't it? It's kind of weird how it works. When you sit down at a table together and you share a meal together, we tend to let down our guard just a little bit. And I don't even know that it's intentional. I think it's just a natural process that happens. And as we do that, conversations start to change, don't they? We start to move beyond the superficial and we start to open up just a little bit. We start to share things that matter in our lives, don't we? And it can be any number of things. We might sit down at a table and as we start to share the things that are important, we maybe share about our personal interest, maybe hobbies, maybe social activities we like to engage in. Maybe we share about our family just a little bit more. We share about our family story, where we've come from, who our parents were, maybe our heritage. Maybe we share a little bit about what's going on in our lives that's important to us. Maybe things at school. Maybe things that are happening in our work situation. But you know what happened when Jesus would sit down? I believe with all my heart He talked about all those things because I believe Jesus addressed the whole person. But we also see that Jesus always found a way to get to the spiritual as well. And I can't help but believe as the people here in Acts chapter 2 met together to break bread, that as they got to know each other on a personal level, because that's a part of coming together as a group of people, I'm sure that they shared in all these aspects that we just mentioned. What they enjoyed to do, what their trade might have been, their family situation, but I believe with everything in me, they talked about Jesus together. They shared maybe what the struggle might be in their lives in coming to Christ because, let's be honest, coming to Christ isn't always easy. Sometimes it can be downright hard. Sometimes there's going to be consequences in a family relationship. Sometimes it involves a complete change in our social networking and our social relationships. And I believe as they sat there and shared meals together, that they talked about these things. And they encouraged each other on how they might be able to work through these or share Jesus in new ways, or how they might learn and grow in Christ in some way. As I thought about this, I couldn't help but think about Travis for a little bit. And Travis, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a second. Several months ago, I'll call it a ministry maybe for lack of a better word, was introduced on a Wednesday night. It was called the Bread Breakers Ministry. And what we're talking about was really the concept, right, Travis, of trying to get together and get a more personal and deeper level with people. More so than what we might call a four-year conversation. But Travis, I don't know what you think. I would say hadn't quite panned out maybe the way that you had hoped. And I think here's part of the problem. And I know we didn't label it a program, but in honesty, that's kind of how it comes across. And you know, if you've ever been a part of a religious group of the church long enough, you've seen the life cycle of programs, haven't you? Right? Programs kind of come and they start with a bang, and maybe they'll last for a little while, but over time they tend to kind of go down. And so I'm personally not a fan of programs. I just think that's not the way God intended. You see, the problem is this. This should just be a part of our DNA. It has to be a part of who we are as God's people. And when it becomes a part of who we are as God's people, it's not going to fail. It'll thrive. It'll be sustainable because it's not something that's put on a board and measured with metrics. It's just a part of who we are. And we have this innate desire to want to know God's people better, to be a part of a group of people that are connected in some meaningful way. And sharing a meal is just one small way that we can do that. And then the last thing we see is this, that fellowship included sharing their praise. And John, you may need to hit that one for me. My clicker's not working. And maybe let's just ask this. What would be a natural response to all of this? I hope you've been able to think with me about putting yourself in the shoes of the individuals that were there on the day of Pentecost. And the excitement is almost palatable as you and I sit here. You can almost sense it, everything that's going on in their lives, and that's why I can't help but think this is as close to perfect as the church has ever been. And what would be a natural response to everything that's happening, all this sharing that's going on in their lives? Wouldn't a natural response be found in verse 47? Praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. A natural response is praising God. It's worshiping Him. It's acknowledging Him. It's thanking Him. It's celebrating. It's rejoicing in the salvation that's found in the Messiah, the one that they've waited and longed for their whole lives, the one that their ancestors died waiting for, the one that you and I don't have to wait for any longer, the one that's living amongst us, that gives us life through the cross and through His blood, that allows us to share in this incredible relationship with all of us that are gathered here in this room. But you see, here's the amazing thing. This worship wasn't just a corporate worship that happened once a week. This was a worship that happened daily. There was a part of the sharing of their possessions. There was a part of the sharing of their presence. There was a part of the sharing of their plates as they had meals together. You see, praising God was an everyday occurrence that was the result of this incredible fellowship that we read about in verse 42. So we think about, where does this leave us? A lot's changed, hasn't it, in some 2,000 years? I wonder sometimes if maybe some of that excitement and genuine appreciation of the Messiah has maybe waned a little bit. But you know, there's a principle. Even though there's a lot of differences that separate us and them, there's a principle that transcends time that I think applies to us out of this passage. And I think it leaves us with a choice. And the principle is this: being a part of the church requires being involved in each other's lives. And the choice it leaves us with, I would summarize this way. You know, we live in a culture that's primarily driven by what I would call consumerism. And it's easy for that mentality even to infiltrate a church or religious group. And you see, the idea behind consumerism is this: I show up and I participate because there's something I get in return for that. And so being a part of a church, we can be here and we can sit in the pews every week, but the expectation is, what am I going to get? What do I walk out of here with that maybe somebody has given to me or that I've received as a benefit by being here? But that's different than being a contributor. And you see, that's where the choice comes in. Because to be involved in each other's lives means we have to contribute. We roll up our sleeves. We get dirty in the messiness of life because life isn't always clean and neat like we want it to be. And I think that's one of the lessons we learn here in Acts chapter 2. These people found themselves in a really unique situation. One that they hadn't planned for, and one, in all honesty, that could have caused some problems. But yet they chose to roll up their sleeves, to be connected together, to share in each other's lives. And as we think about ourselves this morning, and we think about this concept of fellowship, I think there's a lot of challenges that it can really make for all of us. Because one of the hardest things sometimes is reaching beyond our circle of friends, because it's easy to fellowship those people we're closest to, isn't it? It's easy to be engaged with maybe a handful of people that we already have something in common with socially. The challenge is, how do we look beyond that circle? Because the makeup of our church family has changed a lot over the last few years. We're nothing more than a reflection of what's happening in our community around us. And so as you look around, faces are different and names have changed. And it's easy sometimes to allow that to separate us. And it's also easy sometimes to say, I don't have the energy to get involved in the difficulties of people's lives. And so our challenge is this. How do we leave here this morning thinking about this concept of sharing in our lives together in a way that helps us become closer, where we share not just in our possessions, but maybe more importantly in our presence, by gathering together and sharing a meal so that we get to know each other on a more deeper and personal level, so that we can praise God in a way that is meaningful and powerful because of the way that He has blessed us by being a part of the church. An incredible blessing that was purchased by the blood of Christ that allows us to experience community in a profound way that God designed it. I hope all of us, starting with me, will think about that this morning. If you're here this morning and you're searching for Christ through your journey of faith, we'd love to share Him with you. Or maybe you're here and you're just struggling in your journey. Maybe you're one of those people that feel alone as you sit surrounded by 100 plus people this morning. Let me encourage you that you're not alone. We'd love to help you. We'd love to put our arm around you. We'd love to encourage you in your walk of faith this morning. If we can help you in any way, let us know how while together we stand and sing.